Hello everyone. Before starting, make sure you like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. That way, YouTube will continue showing you stories just like this one. Sometimes the most unsettling truths aren't hidden deep in the woods or some forgotten valley. They stand directly in front of us, smiling and waving as if absolutely nothing is wrong in the world. She was a quiet, thin girl with skin that was pale and hair the color of worn straw. To the people of her small town, she was simply another child walking to school every morning, lunch pail in her hand. But those who looked closer, those who truly paid attention, noticed one thing that never sat quite right. She called her uncle Daddy, and not as a joke. Not in the casual manner a child might mix up names. She genuinely meant it. The other children whispered about it on the playground, but no one dared to ask her why. Some of the older women in town, the ones who had lived there long enough to remember everyone's family tree, exchanged glances whenever her name was brought up. It was as if they all knew something that they weren't permitted to say out loud. In towns like this, bloodlines run in very tight circles, and secrets run even tighter. Everyone had heard the phrase, keeping it in the family, but no one expected those words to be taken so literally in the year she was born. Her story did not start with her. It began decades earlier with a family too proud to marry outside its own name. A family that valued control over everything else. Control of land, control of reputation, and control of the women born into it. She was merely the latest product of an arrangement that no outsider was ever supposed to notice. And yet, here she was, walking Main Street in broad daylight, the living proof of generations of whispered arrangements and closed doors. The strangest part was that no one attempted to hide her. No one sent her away. No one even changed her last name. She was hidden in plain sight because, in this place, what was forbidden elsewhere was simply tradition. The truth, when it finally surfaced, was far worse than anyone in town was willing to believe. And to truly understand it, we have to go back to the day her mother vanished. Her mother's name was Margaret. In the spring of 1987, she vanished without any warning. There were no frantic search parties combing the fields, no missing person posters, and no deputy knocking on doors. People claimed she had gone up north for work, but even those who repeated that line didn't sound convinced. Margaret had been obedient, quiet, and painfully shy. She rarely spoke above a whisper and never looked strangers in the eye. For someone like her to run away alone was not just unlikely, it was impossible. But one man didn't seem worried at all, her brother. His name was Thomas, and he was 20 years older than Margaret. He had always been a shadow in her life, looming, present, but rarely speaking in public. He farmed the exact stretch of land their family had worked for over a century. People generally said he was strange but ultimately harmless. The truth, however, was far more complicated. Not long after Margaret left, Thomas started making trips into town with a baby girl in the passenger seat of his rusted pickup. The child had Margaret's soft eyes and Margaret's pale hair. She couldn't have been more than a few months old. And yet, when anyone asked where she had come from, Thomas insisted she was his. He didn't blink, didn't look away, and didn't hesitate. He called her his daughter. The town did not press the issue. They had learned over generations that pressing only made things worse. But the whispers began again, especially among the oldest residents who remembered a time when the family's name was spoken with both unease and respect. They spoke quietly of the real reason Margaret had never been allowed to attend dances, why she'd never dated anyone, and why she had been kept so close to home. Thomas had been watching her for years. Some say Margaret tried to tell someone, perhaps a cousin or a neighbor, but the words died before they could leave her mouth. In families like theirs, loyalty was not a virtue, it weighed as survival. Breaking that loyalty meant exile, and exile was considered worse than death. By the time the girl was able to talk, she was calling Thomas Daddy without hesitation. And Thomas openly encouraged it. He smiled whenever she said it. He corrected her if she ever slipped up. By the time she reached kindergarten, even her teachers believed he was her father. Only a few old women in town knew the truth, and they took it right to their graves. But buried truths have a way of resurfacing, and in this specific case, they would surface in the most disturbing way imaginable. The girl grew up surrounded by deliberate silences and half-truths. In that small farming community, everyone seemed to know their role in keeping the lie alive. Teachers marked father on school forms without a second thought. Neighbors politely nodded when they passed Thomas and her on the dirt road, never daring to mention Margaret's name. It was as if her mother had been completely erased, scrubbed from the memory of the town itself. And yet, there were moments when the truth bled through the cracks. One winter afternoon, when she was 8 years old, she wandered into the attic of the old farmhouse. Dust hung thick in the air, stirred by the faint light coming through a warped window. There, tucked inside a rotting trunk, she discovered a photograph of a young woman holding a newborn. The woman's eyes were unmistakable, wide, gentle, and her own. She carried the picture downstairs, asking Thomas who the woman was. He froze for a long moment. The only sound in the room was the ticking of the clock on the wall. Then, without answering, he snatched the photograph from her hands and fed it right into the wood stove. The flames consumed it in mere seconds. "Some things are better left alone," he said, his voice low, almost calm. But that night, she overheard him pacing in the kitchen, muttering to himself, and she knew, even at 8 years old, that she had found something she was never meant to see. From that day on, the boundaries of her life closed in tighter. She was never left alone with neighbors and was never allowed to stay overnight at a friend's house. Her schooling became irregular. Sometimes she wouldn't show up for weeks, and no one in authority ever came to ask why. This was a place where law was flexible, where the family name outweighed any written statute, and her last name, his last name, was one you simply didn't challenge. But people still noticed things. The way she kept her eyes fixed on the floor when adults spoke to her, the way she flinched whenever someone reached toward her shoulder, and above all, the way she clung to Thomas, as though stepping too far away from him would mean something terrible. To the casual observer, it appeared to be devotion. To those who understood the unspoken history of that family, it looked like captivity dressed as love. The truth was still buried. But the soil was beginning to loosen, and the first real sign of what was coming appeared on her 12th birthday when a stranger arrived in town asking questions no one wanted to answer. The man introduced himself as a journalist from Lexington. He claimed to be working on a piece about rural family histories. But from the moment he stepped foot in town, his questions went far deeper than any genealogy chart. He asked about Margaret, where she'd gone, why she had left, and who she had left behind. Most people pretended they didn't remember her at all. But in a town where every family's roots are tangled together, pretending not to remember is essentially the same as confessing you know exactly what happened. The journalist came to the farmhouse one afternoon in late summer. The air was heavy with the smell of cut hay, and cicadas droned in the distance. Thomas met him at the gate, standing with his thumbs hooked into his suspenders, a faint smile on his lips. The conversation was short, far too short. Thomas said he didn't know anyone named Margaret. And as for the girl playing barefoot in the dirt beside the porch, she's mine. The words came out sharp with a finality that dared the man to press further. But the journalist wasn't easily intimidated. Over the next few days, he visited the town's records office, the library, and even the old church, where yellowing baptism logs still bore Margaret's name. And that's when the thread started to pull loose. The girl's birth had never been officially recorded. No certificate, no hospital record, and no witnesses outside the family. To the state, she simply did not exist. One evening, the journalist found himself at the local diner. An elderly woman slid into the booth across from him without asking. She kept her eyes focused on the formica table as she spoke in a low, unsteady voice. "She's not his daughter," she said. "She's his sister's girl." Then, after a long pause, "and her sister didn't run away. She's buried here somewhere nobody will ever find her." Before he could ask anything more, she slipped out into the night, leaving him alone with the smell of frying bacon and coffee. That was the first time anyone had dared to break the silence. But in places like this, breaking silence comes with a price. Word got back to Thomas before the journalist even left the diner parking lot. And the next morning, the stranger's car was discovered at the edge of town. Keys still in the ignition, doors unlocked. He was gone without so much as a goodbye. The girl didn't know about the journalist. Not yet. But soon, the walls around her small, strange life would start to crack, and the first blow would come from inside the family itself. It started with a fever, the kind that comes suddenly, like a punishment. She was 13. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her skin burned, and her eyes darted wildly even in sleep. Thomas refused to take her to the hospital, claiming it would just pass. Said he could handle it. But as the days dragged on, her condition worsened. She spoke nonsense, sometimes in screams, sometimes in whispers. At night, she cried out and wept for a woman she couldn't remember, a mother, a woman with a singing voice and soft hands. One of the cousins, a woman named Clara, who was barely tolerated by Thomas but still tied to the family by blood, came to check on her. Clara had always been the quiet rebel, the one who married out of town and brought her husband back, the one who let her daughters wear store-bought dresses instead of hand-me-downs. She found the girl lying in a sweat-soaked bed, barely conscious. Her lips were cracked, and her wrists were bruised from being held down during the night, and something about the bruises stopped Clara cold. She knew the family had always been odd. But now, standing in that room with the stink of isolation and rot thick in the air, Clara realized something was fundamentally, deeply wrong. The bruises were small, round fingerprints. Not the kind left in anger, the kind left in possession. Clara waited until Thomas stepped out to chop wood. Then, with trembling hands, she wrapped the girl in a blanket and carried her to the truck. They drove 2 towns over to a clinic where no one knew the family name. The doctor didn't say much, but the look on his face when he examined the girl said everything. Infections, evidence of long-term neglect, malnutrition, and worse. He asked Clara to step outside. When she returned, her face was pale as paper. She didn't speak a single word during the drive home, but word spread as it always does, not just in whispers, but in reports filed quietly, passed between social workers, county clerks, and finally, the sheriff's office. They sent 2 deputies out to the farm. By then, it was already too late. Thomas was gone. The house was empty, the floors covered in torn paper and muddy footprints. The only thing left behind was a Bible with names scratched out in ink and a page torn clean through where Margaret's name had once been written. The girl was placed into protective custody, but that did not mean she was safe, because even though Thomas had vanished, his presence still lingered. At first, she thought she was finally free. The small foster home in the next county felt like another planet compared to the suffocating air of the farmhouse. She had a door that locked, her own bed, and meals that came at the same time every day. But freedom is a strange thing for someone who's never known it. She didn't know what to do with a touch that didn't mean control or with silence that wasn't threatening. The nightmares began almost immediately. She'd wake in the dark, heart hammering, certain she had heard Thomas's boots on the stairs. Sometimes she swore she saw his shadow in the corner of her room, just standing there, waiting. The foster parents dismissed it as trauma, but the girl knew the difference between the real thing and a dream. And in her bones, she knew he was still close. Within a month, strange things started to happen. Notes left on the porch in handwriting she recognized. A Bible verse scrolled on the inside of her bedroom closet door, "The child shall obey the father." A dead bird on the windowsill. The foster parents thought it was the work of some neighborhood kids, but she didn't. The handwriting, the phrasing, the choice of words, they all belonged to him. One night, as summer bled into autumn, she woke to the sound of gravel shifting in the driveway. Peering through the curtain, she saw a shape leaning against the street light at the edge of the property, just far enough away to be hidden in shadow, but she didn't need to see his face to know it was Thomas. He never moved, just stood there until the sun began to rise, then melted back into the tree line. The sheriff was called. Patrols were made, but without proof, they could do nothing. Probably just some drifter, they said. But the girl knew. She could feel him. The same way you can feel the weight of a storm before the sky breaks. And then one day, a letter arrived in the mail. No return address, just her name written in a shaky hand. Inside was a single Polaroid, the old farmhouse taken from the dirt road out front. In the window of the upstairs bedroom, a figure stood watching. The note beneath it read, "Come home, little girl." It was the moment she realized the truth. She had escaped the house, but not him. And as long as he was out there, her life would never truly be hers. She didn't go back. Not willingly. But in towns like this, history has a way of pulling you home, whether you want it to or not. Years passed. She turned 18, moved 2 counties over, and tried to make a life for herself. Small apartment, cashier job, nights spent trying to forget. But forgetting wasn't easy. Every creak in the hallway outside her door sounded like Thomas's boots. Every man with broad shoulders in the grocery store made her stomach knot. Then one day, while stocking shelves, she saw him, older now, hair grayer, but the same narrowed eyes, the same heavy frame. He didn't say a word, just stood at the end of the aisle watching her. She froze. Her coworker called her name twice before she turned around. And when she looked back, he was gone. She called the police again. They said they couldn't help unless he had threatened her. She told them she knew what he was planning, but they didn't hear the urgency in her voice. "He's family," one officer said, like that erased the past. Like that meant safety. It was about a month later when the package arrived. No sender, no postage. Inside was a folded piece of fabric, the same quilt that had covered her bed in the farmhouse. And wrapped inside it was a lock of pale hair, her own hair, cut from her head when she was a little girl. She didn't remember him keeping it, but she wasn't surprised. That night she dreamed of the farmhouse, not as it was when she left, but as it had been in its prime, clean and bright, white paint, fields heavy with crops. Margaret was there too, sitting in a rocking chair holding a baby. She didn't speak. She just looked up, her eyes wide with warning. And then, Thomas appeared from behind the chair, placing his hands on both their shoulders. When she woke, she knew there was only one way this ended. She could keep running, looking over her shoulder until the day she died, or she could go back and face him. So on a cold afternoon in late November, she drove out to Harlan County. The farmhouse still stood at the end of the long dirt road, sagging, abandoned, windows clouded with dust. But she knew he was inside. She could feel him. And when she stepped through the door, she finally understood the truth. She had spent her whole life circling. Some family ties aren't just hard to break. They're meant to strangle.